Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and welcome to another edition of Hilaal Live. My name is Luqman Shadrack, all the way from the Cape Town studios. Thanks for watching us on channel 347 on DSTV, also live stream on www.hilaal.tv. Now today on my slot on Hilaal Live, we feature the Women's Legal Centre. We all know that August is Women's Month, where we paid tribute to the incredible women who shape our world. We recently witnessed a very powerful speech by the President at the Union Buildings. But we were left wondering, okay, is that enough? You know, can there be more that needs to be done? And how can we turn this celebration of women into tangible change that will bear fruit in the coming years as well? Looking at the difference and the stance that women have taken over the last very many years, and especially celebrating 100 years of women being in the legal fraternity. And I'd like to welcome our very special guest, Chriscy Blouws from the Women's Legal Centre. Chriscy, thank you for joining us and welcome.
Good evening. Thank you so much for having us.
It's my absolute pleasure. I had Judge Rihanna Khan Parker in not too long ago talking about and celebrating that milestone, 100 years where women have really made a difference in our legal fraternity, but other parts of the world as well, where women have been celebrated. I think in India and some other parts it was even longer, where women were accepted into the legal fraternity. But for those that don't know too much about the Women's Legal Centre, give us a bit of history. How long has it been around for? And some of the wonderful work that you do.
Thank you so much. So the Women's Legal Centre is an African feminist law centre.
Okay.
We're based in Cape Town, Western Cape, but our work is national. We work internationally as well with partners, organizations and stakeholders across the spectrum, both regionally and internationally. The Women's Legal Centre is an organization that is over 20 years old, has forged strongly for the rights of women in South Africa. And we have 5 programmatic or thematic focus areas.
Okay.
One of them being women's rights to access equality in relationships, women's rights to access housing, land and tenure security, women's rights to be free from violence, women's rights to work in favorable and just working conditions, and women's rights to bodily autonomy such as sexual, reproductive and health rights.
Okay.
And the way in which we work is through public interest and strategic litigation, but we ensure that we use a multi-pronged approach.
Okay.
So that means using tools such as advocacy, policy and law reform, education and training in communities and with women in communities and grassroots organizations. And we are a walk-in organization, so we serve women pro bono. That is for free of charge. We do not charge clients for consultations or our representation of them. And we are a non-profit organization, non-governmental organization, non-partisan as well. And so where women would like to approach the Women's Legal Centre, they could do so freely on a daily basis.
Brilliant. Well done. Well, kudos to you and your team for being there for those that don't have a voice when it comes to the people infringing on their rights. So well done. So let's dive into why examining the law through an intersectional lens is crucial, especially in this day and age as well. And how does, considering different identities after our understanding of legal matters, how does that pertain to our everyday life as well?
Well, look, man, the Women's Legal Centre's work is underpitted, and the foundation of our work is underpitted by practicing law through an intersectional and feminist lens. What this means is that we don't apply the law in its black and white course and as if it applies neutrally to all people the same.
Right.
Because we understand that when women experience discrimination, she experiences discrimination on her intersecting forms of identity, such as her race, her gender, her socioeconomic background. And when you practice law without this intersectional lens, oftentimes what we find ourselves with is laws, policies, and we've seen that in South Africa, that really don't reflect the lived reality majority of women and the biases that still exist within our society. And so placing an intersectional lens before your litigation, even within court, essentially we're using the tool of intersectionality to bring this face before the court and to bring this lived reality before the court itself.
It's can be a multifacet of discovery that needs to be done, and I would imagine that no two cases are the same. And the way your approach, your legal centre's approach to each case, that would also matter, and a lot of research probably needs to be done as well.
So this is exactly the term. So the term intersectionality is a term coined by Kimberly Crenshaw. But essentially what it does is that it, one, looks at the diversity, as I've mentioned, but it also looks at the nuance and the purpose of the law. And so this is also important because what you have then is when you look at the law and the purpose that it was intended to or designed for, but we still see that women still experience discrimination in so many ways systemically at the hands of the law or actors that are supposed to implement the law. We see how important it is to then place this intersectional lens before the law to achieve substantive equality.
Brilliant, well done. I like that as well. Now, indeed, it's obviously a very powerful perspective on how you would look at the law and obviously each case as well. Let's explore how the patriarchal system has and maybe can influence the legal outcomes, and maybe elaborate for us a little bit on how these systems tend to, and I coin a phrase, and I'm probably going to not be favorable with some people, but how does this favor or seems to have favor men more than women?
So look, man, even in your introduction tonight, you said, we're talking about 100 years of women, but in the legal fraternity. Fraternity is still the paternal kind of way in which the legal society has been named. And that's a simple example to start off with answering your question about how women are still viewed in society, right? As simple as those terms. We find patriarchal norms, standards, and bias still exist within our society and within our legal context because of our apartheid and colonial history and legacy that still lives rich and still lives deep within our society. I can give you two examples, for examples of cases that we've worked on in which those still persist deeply, and one of them is within the work we do around domestic workers, where domestic work is really the backbone of our economy and our society, but it's work that continues to be undervalued, underpaid, and women work in these conditions with so many human rights violations because still of this colonial context to the way in which black women's work was viewed and in the way that black women were deemed to be suitable only for domestic work, for example. That stigma and that patriarchal norm still exist within that work sector. Another example, for example, is where women still experience violence. We know statistics show us that predominantly women experience violence at the hands of their perpetrators, which statistics show is predominantly men. And so then when we have society which still views women as liars or gossipers and treat women with caution when they report violence, you see starkly how patriarchal norms still exist within our society and how it's perpetuated through our legal systems as well.
I mean, in this day and age, you would not expect anyone to be treated in this manner and to, just have this disrespect. I want to take you back a couple of steps with regards to the Domestic Act, the Domestic Workers Act, with regards to, that was passed a couple of years ago. Off air we were talking about that very few claims have been settled. Wherein lies the problem? Is it in the judicial system? Is it in the way the claim is made? Talk us through that very quickly.
So I think that this is a multifaceted issue, which is why it's so important for even as lawyers to have a multi-pronged approach to legal issues, and to have a multi-pronged approach that really carries your clients with you. We have, for example, a great labor law framework. However, our laws have recognized that domestic workers are still a specific sector that works in very vulnerable conditions, and therefore we have, for example, a sectoral determination which speaks directly to the labor relations and the rights of domestic workers. For many years, domestic workers were excluded specifically as a category from compensation and the compensation legislation, which meant that where domestic workers suffered injuries in the course and scope of their work, died at the homes of their employers, domestic workers who worked in private homes were unable to claim compensation at all. This changed recently in our Constitutional Court judgment, in which the Women's Legal Centre was a part of as well, in the case known as Mahlangu versus the Department of Labour, in which a domestic worker who died at her employer's home, her daughter challenged these provisions to say, and we intervened with this intersectional lens to say that where domestic workers who work in private homes are excluded, this is direct discrimination based on gender, based on race, because we know the domestic work sector is largely gendered in nature. And then if 80% of the sector is women, majority of that 80% is black women.
Absolutely.
And so you have to look at that intersecting levels and identities. And this is the lens we brought before the court. The law has changed significantly. Domestic workers are now included.
Nice.
There have been amendments to the compensation legislation. So there's now a COIDA Amendment Act, which is all really great and powerful. However, as you've mentioned, there's still a gap in the lived reality. And this is to go back to your point about seeing patriarchal views still exist within our legal system. Because once again, where is the exclusion of black women who work in homes rooted from? And yet it finds its way into our laws. And so we still have the exclusion, and women are still struggling. Statistics show us that women are still struggling to make claims to the compensation fund. Women are still struggling to have them registered because there are also obligations on the employers themselves.
Of course. Thank you so much for sharing that. We're going to take an ad break. When we come back, we chat a bit more to Chriscy Blouws from the Women's Legal Centre right here in Cape Town. And fascinating information being passed through by Chriscy, and I'm sure our viewers are enjoying it as well. You are still watching Hilaal Live. Assalamu alaikum. Welcome back to Hilaal Live. Thanks for watching us on Channel 347. On our legal slot today, we're chatting about exploring the law through an intersectional lens. And in studio from the Women's Legal Centre based here in Cape Town, Chriscy Blouws, thanks once again for joining us.
Thank you.
Now, before the break, you made mention about the Domestic Workers Act that was passed a couple of years ago. And the, for a lack of better words, maybe the... there's so many claims that have not been fulfilled. There is a lot of work still to be done with regards to how the judicial system handles cases as well. But can you maybe share an example or two from the Women's Legal Centre, such as, I know you have a campaign on advocating for amendments of COIDA that we spoke about as well, and where intersectionally the influenced, maybe there was a legal case that influenced the way you work and the way the Act has been put to us in South Africa.
So, as mentioned, we were amicus curiae in the case of Mahlangu versus the Department of Labour. When you're an amicus before a court, essentially you're a friend of the court.
Okay.
You're not representing a specific party. You come before a court to bring specifically a lens or an issue before the court that they may miss during the litigation.
Gotcha.
And we brought this intersectional lens before the Constitutional Court. If I can explain it and maybe just break it down, it looks like when we talk about domestic workers being excluded from compensation legislation, and we talk about how the compensation legislation, for example, speaks to dependents. However, when you look at the law, dependents are defined as up to a certain age and must be in tertiary education.
Okay.
A lived reality context will show that even then now, since the court has included domestic workers, and even though the COIDA amendments now include domestic workers, if we look at the lived reality that domestic workers are predominantly black women who come from underprivileged and disadvantaged communities, we know that a dependent looks very different in an African context. You can have your niece who you have taken in and is your dependent. You can have your grandmother living with you and is your dependent. And so when we look at the law in its neutral form and apply it the same to everyone, black women will be disproportionately affected and discriminated against, because in an African context, dependent and spouse is a very different composition. People are not always married in terms of civil law. They have life partners who they've been residing with for years. And so these were some of the lived reality examples we brought before the court and we brought before Parliament when we made submissions on the COIDA amendments to show how you need to take into context this lived reality of women to actually provide substantive equality, meaning law that actually going to change the day-to-day for women. So these was an example of a case in which we litigated with this intersectional lens and brought about really positive change. It was the first time our Constitutional Court outrightly said that an intersectional lens is important to have before litigation, and where they acknowledge that this intersectional lens essentially renders a previously invisible group now visible and brings their diversity to the forefront of the case.
Wow, very interesting as well. And I'm so glad you guys are around because I would imagine there are so many cases that fall flat without being given the proper legal assistance always. And that can have a ripple effect on so many different things as well. How can we, and I say we including men, women, children, everyone, as a society work towards maybe dismantling patriarchal systems within the legal framework?
I think the starting point is always education and training and awareness. I think a lot of times people are unable to enforce their rights or unable to access justice because they are simply unaware of the process. And then the second leg to that is where I do come to a court, be it a magistrate's court or to the police or to another stakeholder organization that's responsible for implementation, and I am unaware, but I also receive kind of secondary victimization at that point or that institution, it creates a second layer of vulnerability, especially for women who try to seek access to justice. So I think education, training and awareness is essential to work alongside the legal process because you need to shape the narrative of society along with the narrative within the court. Those are two very different things and they need to complement each other. We can no longer just litigate to an extent where no one else outside of the court understands the processes or know what's entailed. We need to litigate in a way that empowers women and airs their voices before the litigation, but also helps to shape the narrative in society as well.
Nice. So how can we, including individuals and maybe lawmakers, because that's where I think the bigger difference would come from, because knowing how the law works as well, and general society as a whole work towards more an intersectional approach to the law, to cases, to individuals that lay cases as well or put forward cases?
The starting point, I would say, is for, especially when we're speaking to lawmakers, is for you to ensure that the law that we are changing is actually informed by the community you wish to serve. We cannot say we want to create law or change law for a community, be it women within a specific community, be it within a specific work sector, be it within health, in whichever issue you're dealing with. We cannot create and enact law without that law being informed by the people you are advocating for. And I think that's an essential start, because even if we then look at it through the lens of lawmakers, if you're doing consultations with the affected community, or in this case domestic workers and the women themselves, if you're doing consultation, you'll understand dynamics of access that a woman who works in a rural context versus a woman who works in an urban context has. That's a completely different point of access. You'll understand then the difference for a woman who lives on a farm versus a woman who lives in the CBD and their geographical access to certain institutions. And so therefore, if as a lawmaker, as a lawyer, as an activist, as a community member, if whatever initiative, law reform or policy change we would want to make is informed by the voice of the community and you work from the bottom up, you're then able to have effective change.
Nice. Chrissy, thanks once again for coming into studio. Before I let you go, okay, would you recommend some resources for our listeners to learn more about what we spoke about here today, intersectional gender studies?
Thank you so much. I think the first point of reference I would like to say to the viewers is to maybe check out the Women's Legal Centre's website.
Okay.
So that's www.wlce.co.za. We also have an Instagram page. It's WLCE_Cape Town. We have a Facebook page. We have LinkedIn. And these would be the starting points. We recently did a campaign on domestic worker rights, on the COIDA amendments, and on all of the obligations, not only on employers, but also on employees, the rights and the obligations. And these are all done in videos, in text, on our social media, and on our website. So viewers are encouraged to go and follow us, look at the website to kind of understand more and get more information on this.
Brilliant. Once again, to you and your team, thank you for all the wonderful work that you do. At least there's someone out there, fighting for those that don't know the law so well, but more importantly, making a difference in our society, making a difference in the world, and the ripple effect that has on our society as a whole as well. So may all your future projects grow from strength to strength.
Thank you so much.
My absolute pleasure. Have a wonderful evening.
Thank you. Same to you.
My pleasure. Right, so that's Chriscy Blouws from the Legal Women's Centre, Women's Legal Centre in Cape Town, where they do excellent work. And if you ever need their assistance, go and check them out on www.wlce.co.za. After the break, we chat all things dermatology, and we have a doctor in studio who's going to chat to us a little more as well. You are still watching Hilaal Live.